This is the falsification part 2 because Miss Willingworth just came in then. So, flu, done, her, getting on to now. Now, so what her said is then with this insane university student is that ultimately we all have certain things, part of our life, certain area, that we will not accept falsification criteria for. And the issue is about whether we can identify whether we have a right blick or whether we have a wrong blick, not a question about the blick. And ultimately what he said is that rather than it simply being a question about whether it's true or false, it's a question of meaning. And he called this the deepest concern. So what he said was that it's about exploring our blick and exploring what is important and what matters to us. So in the case of the parable of the gardener, what he was criticising Flew is that just because one person believes in a certain thing, this obviously influences their decision. This influences them because they see insight or they see the hand of someone. And it's not just that person, but you'd also say the atheist also has a blick. So they are more likely to not see God's presence, to not see God's work. It's still exactly the same thing, it's just a different type of blick. Now, the third person in this debate is Mitchell. Now, Basil Mitchell, he gives us his own little analogy, or his own story, and this is of the partisan and the stranger. And he's criticising both her and Flew. And what he says is that ultimately both of them are wrong. And the reason that they're wrong is that what her's trying to suggest is that you can have a right blick or a wrong blick, but also that ultimately everyone's the same. We all have these blind spots, effectively what a blick is, a blind spot. And obviously what Flew is saying is that there are some things that we will simply never accept criteria and we just justify it or qualify it further and ultimately reduce and dies. Well, what Mitchell says is that that's not actually the case, that the believer does have falsification criteria. They do accept it. So it would be someone who was guilty of an error in faith as well as logic, to quote Mitchell, if they were to accept that there's no evidence. They accept the evidence, but they have stronger evidence to believe it. Now the example that he gives is set during the Second World War in France and with the resistance movement. Now the resistance movement was notoriously secret, no one would know who the ultimate leader was, and you'd only ever know two other men. Now this was the idea that if anyone was caught, you couldn't reveal much about the organisation to the Nazis. Now, a stranger is in a bar drinking, and there's a partisan. So the partisan's the supporter, a member of the resistance. And he meets this stranger, he's never met him before. And over the course of the evening, the stranger effectively reveals to him that he's in fact the leader. Now, the conversation was long, the experience was great, and the man believes him. And he says, your faith is going to be sorely tested, but have faith that I am the leader. And the following day, or in subsequent days, he sees the stranger in the uniform of the Nazis. And his faith is sorely tested, but he still believes. Now, the point of that is that, yes, there is evidence. There is a lot of evidence that the man is not, in fact, the leader. But he has another piece of evidence. And he is simply weighing up the evidence and believing that, yes, this is what I believe. So you go back to the original parable. The man, there might be lots of evidence that he isn't, there isn't a gardener caring for the stretch in the jungle. But the piece of evidence which he originally saw, he still believes, which leaves him to think of the intangible, invisible, and so on and so on. Now, finally, the only other person of note is Braithwaite. Now, Braithwaite doesn't really enter into the debate, but what he does say is that the whole debate is not necessarily relevant. He says that it's about cognitive and non-cognitive. Ultimately, both the verification and the falsification principle was saying that there's cognitive language and non-cognitive language. Cognitive language you can verify and falsify, non-cognitive you can't. What Braithwaite says is, well, yes, religious language is non-cognitive, but it is still meaningful, because that is not whether it can be verified or falsified. It's about whether it conveys information, whether it conveys feelings, emotions, and it does. And the only thing I should perhaps say, Hick made another criticism about her when he said that there is a real issue about whether you can identify whether someone has a right blick or a wrong blick. And that's the falsification part 2.